the story. So from that account that he told all the way through his life, Cage began to develop his theory of silence as a framework for active listening. He made that event critical because of what he said about it, how he made it work for his project at large. As he retold the story, the point became that in a space where all the sound is removed, one still hears something. Sounds one does not intend to make, no intention. Sounds that one doesn't plan, and therefore that sound is not governed necessarily by intentionality. Transferring this revelation onto the evolving conceptions in his work, Cage launched a particularly clear critique of intentionality, relativising the primacy of rhythmic structure in composing. And with an extraordinary model of space, the space of the anechoic chamber, as a kind of technological architecture, determining his definition of oral experience unfolding in time, Cage had a tabula rasa for composition going forward. The value of the anechoic chamber event is that it made sonic space physical. It made the non-intentional palpable. And crucially, it ushered in these new theoretical premises under the auspices of technology. A critical aspect of Cage's account is that the protagonist, a composer, had an experience of sound that he could not identify or predict. It's not a mere detail in the story that he defers to the Harvard engineer. This is the expert explanation of sound under silent conditions that Cage would use to authorise his next moves. The complete story, developed retroactively, generated a profound logic for Cage's next two landmark scores. Imaginary Landscape number 4 for 12 radios, which you have out there, and 433, number 1952. So next slide. Oh, that's the first version of 433. I wanted you to see that because Cage actually lost the first version, and you see the little DT down in the corner, that's David Tudor's initial, so he redrew this score because he liked to play from the 5-staff notation. Of course, Cage probably purposely lost it because this is the most conventional version of that score, and it was such a radical piece that he didn't want that conventionality. So if we could change the slide. So these are the three. In my work on Cage, I've passed out these three scores because everyone thinks 433 is just one thing, and it shows you sort of how he developed that idea through the 50s. So I'll explain that. So Cage's most famous score, 433, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, is at the heart of the most comprehensive period of change in his own oeuvre. The statement of 433, an empty score with only a temporal framework, gave Cage's stunning assertion of silence a material, structural form. Asking his audiences to use the temporal frame to focus their listening, Cage, in effect, realised the contained silence of the anechoic chamber as a score, sutured in perpetuity to a changing world of sounds. 433 developed with Cage's rhetoric and what he needed the score to accomplish as this decade unfolded. So what I mean by sutured in perpetuity, obviously if you only frame time, the sounds of the world are going to be different. Like in 50 years' time, you could still do 433 and it's going to sound like now. It's going to sound contemporary, right? Because he left so much open. And probably we now, even more than in those days, when it was composed, we need to be given something to focus our listening, right? It's an attention deficit disorder. It's at decade of the century. So, and Cage was already worried about that, about technology and all these things that would stop people listening properly. So he gave them something to sit down for 4.5 minutes and just listen. So Music of Changes, Cage would critique his own Music of Changes score from 1951 for its not having taken chance operations beyond the sphere of the composing phase. That is to say, into the realm of performance and reception. 433 asserted the Cagean concept developed in the 1950s that the score was not an object, it was a process. And even the work itself was a process, this very work, changing its format as Cage's own ideas developed and achieved greater clarity. So you'll see that the first 433, as I just suggested, which was composed in 1952, was written on as staff notation, as were, just like the Music of Changes and the Imaginary Landscape No. 4, which you have the score out there, you'll see it's staff notation. So then he recast it in proportional notation, where 1/8 of an inch equals 1 second. And that was the score that seemed to figure the connection Cage made with Rauschenberg's white paintings. If you know the white paintings, the abutments of the canvas look quite like that. So Cage made a score that looked like, and conceptually was very well matched up to those paintings. Of course, Cage is very modest, and he writes in his silence book in 1961, just for the record, Rauschenberg's paintings came first, my 433 came second. But of course he'd been thinking about it for years. He's just giving it away to Rauschenberg there. So, let's see. So the final version, which would be transformed into pure text, its 3 movements rendered as tacit, 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 which, as you know, means don't do anything. If you're in an orchestra and you have tacit, you have to put your instrument down and just wait for the next cue, or maybe for the whole piece. So that form came as Cage was establishing indeterminacy, beginning in 1958. This was also the period in which he was teaching experimental composition at the New School for Social Research in New York. Actually, we have that slide. Actually, can you show me the next slide? No, go back. Oh, well, that's Rauschenberg's white paintings. And then, next one. Okay, actually, yeah, if you can go back to the 3 scores for me. Thanks. Well, I'd like to have the control of it myself, but anyway. Okay, so he's teaching at the New School for Social Research before a class full of students who don't know how to write music. And so they're all presenting their scores as texts, right? I really think this is the moment where Cage's students affected him. He was so influential, but it went the other way. So he had a class full of artists, and he loved it when he went around the room and said, "Do you have any musical training? You?" And they all said, he thought that was fantastic, because he knew something was going to be invented. Okay, so next slide, please. The years 1949 to 53 were critical ones for the artist Robert Rauschenberg as well. Synchronous with Cage's peak years of change, their innovations seemed to dovetail. So Rauschenberg's white paintings of 1951 became the source of an extraordinary bond between Cage and Rauschenberg, advancing the stakes of the work of both of them. In 1961, as I just mentioned, Cage announced that the white paintings had been the catalyst to his most famous score, the silent, non-intentional 433, an open frame in which anything can happen. Of course, it was Cage's theory and his second version of the score that pushed that theorisation of Rauschenberg's paintings into the pivotal conceptual space that they now occupy. Within the next 2 years, actually, next slide. So within the next 2 years, Rauschenberg pursued new models of painting, including the real in close proximity to Cage, painting that used the real world. So his tire print was made with Cage, who actually, Cage drove the car and Rauschenberg crouched down and inked the black ink on the tyres of the car and put the paper under the wheels. So this is sort of a collaborative work. And of course, it's the anti-Jackson Pollock, right? It's an index, an imprint of a process, as Jackson Pollock's strip paintings are, but it's got no expression, zero expression. So it's like a ready-made index, completely unravelling the kind of emotional scale of abstract expression. Finally, his dirt painting, dedicated to Cage, which embodied the found, non-subjective and chance-based elements, and above all, generated a path out of Pollock for the next generation of artists. So Rauschenberg sort of showed the way that, like, if you didn't want to paint anymore, he found all this new media, and he actually, 1953 is an unbelievable year for Rauschenberg. I mean, everyone talks about his combines and the lag of work, and they forget about this year, 2 years before he invents the combine. So he also had an exhibition at the Stable Gallery in New York with a work called Growing Painting, and it had dirt in a box on the wall, and it had grass seeds in the dirt, and he came into the gallery and watered it every so often during the exhibition and grew grass. So that's why it's called Growing Painting. So for instance, George Brecht and others went and saw that and they couldn't believe it. A work of art that changes in time.